how much would you pay for a dirt pedal? Perhaps 25 used, 50 new? That's likely within a lot of people's budgets. Maybe $100 to $200. Could be pushing it for some, but still within the realm of possibility if you play it all the time. Now try $2,000 to $3,000 US. That's right, 20 to 30 Benjamin Franklins in cold hard cash for what is essentially a glorified pile of resistors, capacitors, and op amps. That is, of course, the used pricing for the original Klon Centaurs, which is the topic that we're going down the rabbit hole with today. The Klon Centaur is a unique beast, pun intended, that I've been looking forward to talking about for quite some time. It kind of checks all of those magical gearboxes. You know, it's got a fascinating backstory, really insane internet hype, and yet it still manages to live up to a lot of those expectations and surpass them for me in many ways. And considering this is a 25-ish year old circuit, that's pretty damn impressive. Now, I'm not going to advocate anyone spend, $3 grand on a stomp box when you could buy, an okay used car for that. But some of the derivatives and even modern reissues of this kind of circuit might work for a lot of players, and it's a really versatile one. And this is probably one of the few times on this video series that I could say there's a good chance you would be happy with a pedal that does something like this. Now, the story of the Klon and its legendary reputation is inseparable from its creator, Mr. Bill Finnegan, so we kind of have to start with him. Now, the story goes back in the 80s, he was playing different clubs with his band in the Northeast, and depending on where he was at, his tone would change, which is something that a lot of people that have gigged or toured with tube amplifiers have probably faced before. If you're in a really big venue or you're outside, then you can kind of get away with cranking the master volume, saturating the tubes, getting that lovely harmonic distortion power amp breakup that, makes a lot of tube amp tones what they are, especially on some of those clean edge breakup amplifiers that don't rely on preamp distortion as much. However, if you're in a smaller venue and the sound guy won't let you crank your amp, then you're stuck in kind of a brittle, not quite as mid-saturated, meh guitar tone. Now, in the modern age, we have things like digital amp modelers that are pretty much exactly the same sounding as the real deal if you want to go direct, or a myriad of pedals to make up for that fact. But around that time, you just kind of had to crank amplifiers. That was about the only way you get that sound. Now, he had heard about these magical tube screamers that a lot of people had liked, but he ultimately felt that they weren't for him because they do a lot of the same things that I talk about that can be great for certain genres and absolutely terrible for others, or even just particular play styles. Tube screamers, and even to some extent their asymmetrical clipping cousins, kind of compress and squash the signal, and it gives you a big mid hump. And that can be a cool thing if you want to round off your transient attacks and, make that classic metal sound or even Stevie Ray Vaughan dirt tones, but that's not what he was looking for. What he wanted, basically, was a cranked amplifier in a box, and for all intents and purposes, that didn't really exist yet. After several years of R&D and prototyping work, Mr. Finnegan unveiled his creation, the Klon Centaur, in 1994, with the first order shipping out to customers in January 1995. It didn't take long for even the most legendary of guitar players to take notice, with guitarists like Keith Urban, John Mayer, and too many to name, that still use some derivative of the Klon Centaur on their pedal boards. Now, the story had ended there. This wouldn't be all that interesting. So let's first talk about sort of the business side of things before we talk about how unique the pedal circuit is. So this, you have to remember, was the early days of the modern internet. This was pre-Etsy. eBay was kind of in its fledgling years around that time. There was no Reverb, especially no Amazon.com. So when we say the word boutique pedal or amplifier builder today, it doesn't really mean the same thing. A lot of people like to slap that label on about anyone that isn't like Marshall or Fender amps, when in reality, boutique then was pretty much a guy building pedals on a spare table in his apartment, just like Bill did. Again, because this was sort of before the mainstream gear website days, if you wanted in on the Klon craze, you actually had to manually talk to Mr. Finnegan, supposedly via phone, maybe email worked as well, but the story goes that you actually had to discuss your guitar playing and your tonal needs before he would deem you worthy, or at least see if the Klon was going to be a good fit for you, which is kind of a cool thing, I think, because nowadays, you know, we got manufacturers say, we're making 100 or 250 of these, and whoever gets first dibs gets them. We don't care. Here you go, scalpers. Whereas at least he did try to implement some system where the people who he thought, or was at least led to believe, would be the ones that could actually take advantage of his creation, then they would be the ones to receive it. And I think that's a pretty interesting thing. So if you were indeed put on the wait list, you would eventually get your pedal after a few months of time, and you would pay a pretty penny for it. When these things first released, we're looking at a price tag of around $225. Now, with how a lot of mainstream pedals are priced today, that figure may not seem so outlandish, but you have to remember, the $1995 was a lot stronger than $2019. So when you account for inflation, that puts you at about $380 today. And at least in current year, that can be stretched quite a long ways. You can get a decent guitar for $380, especially used. You can get something like a Moore micro preamp for another $20 or so, which models probably all the amps and cabinets and power amp sounds that a vast majority of players will ever need, not counting custom IRs and tone matches. You can get like a pair of Boss 200 series pedals, which have like a dozen overdrive or reverb or delay or even EQ options, depending on what you're looking at. A lot of stuff out there today, and you don't have to spend a whole lot for it comparatively, which is awesome. Back then, not quite the same situation, especially with amp modeling just starting to take off. And when you consider the fact that all of these pedals were ultimately hand assembled, and you account for parts and labor and time, you know, I don't think the pricing was that insane. Would I have paid for it? No. But for what they were trying to accomplish with these pedals, I think a lot of players, you know, they thought that was pocket change. As it turns out, by the time the Klon was discontinued in 2009, the pricing had increased to about $330 plus shipping and all that stuff. But that keeps up right around with the inflation rate. So Bill actually kept the relative value of the pedal more or less the same throughout the years, which makes these comparisons pretty viable, I think. So that's interesting if you care about that. But all said and done, you get the original run of Klons spanning about 14 to 15 years with a few variations here and there that we'll discuss in detail. But, you know, we've heard pieces of this story in other pedals and gear and that sort of thing. What makes this interesting is when you combine all these ingredients to this asinine soup of hype and limited supply and demand through the roof, then you get this unholy concoction that spawns a legendary reputation and a very painful price tag. Even when Bill was hand building these things and, you know, they were shipping out a few at a time, you know, people would buy them up, at least try to, and sell them secondhand for a pretty profit online in the early days of stuff like eBay and other secondhand sites. Of course, Mr. Finnegan, as anyone should, was not fond of that practice, but once supply was completely done, with under 10,000 units being made, and everyone wants them, then the prices just keep going up. And from what I can tell, it looks like a lot of original people, or original buyers of this pedal, are holding on to them because there's really not that many. There's a lot compared to the number that are made because people are seeing, you know, how much can they get out of theirs. But compared to some other rarer pedals, supply is dwindling pretty fast. But surely this can't just be a simple numbers game, right? I mean, there's plenty of guitars out there that's been made less than 10,000 times, or even other pieces of gear like pedals and amps, and they don't sell for 1,000% their original asking price. Is it the high-profile artists behind them, or do these things just sound that good that when coupled with their rarity, people are willing to pay for it? Hopefully today's video will answer that question for you. But suffice to say, the Klon spawned a whole new movement, even before it was discontinued, but especially after with the Klon clone market. I don't really have to say much about this one. I'm just going to put a few of these pedals, and this is, believe me, only a few of the available Klon derivatives out there. Some of them range from straight up clones, so if you're looking for a more budget-friendly or perhaps a micro version of the Klon circuit, then there's plenty of those available. If you're looking for something that perhaps is expanded upon, then you've got stuff like the Wampler Toneless Deluxe, which adds a full tone stack. They've got different versions of that. There's, even almost down to a T replicas that don't cost as much as an original Klon. So if you're looking for, kind of the same vibe, same assembly style, then you can get something that, basically is a Klon minus the official trademark. And that brings us to the pedal I'll be using today, which no, is not an original Klon, but it's pretty damn close. I would say at least half of it is. This is the Chariotone Horsebreaker. This side is more of a bluesbreaker kind of sound, but this side is the Chariotone Centaur circuit, which is, well, we'll say it has a pretty good reputation. A lot of people think that this is one of the better Klon derivatives out there in terms of authenticity and quality. Never compared it against the real deal, so hard to say, but what I can say is this pedal sounds really good, and it behaves like it should. So plenty of companies were cashing in on this Klon trend for a few years, and plenty are still doing it now. But then Bill reintroduces the Klon as the KTR, which some say stands for Klon the Rebirth or Klon the Reissue, no one really knows. But this was an SMD or surface mount device version of the Klon circuit that was made overseas for a lower cost, costing about $270 for the consumer. And interesting things about it, first of all, it's shrunk down just a little bit in terms of its enclosure size, same controls, same circuit, but it includes a little, shall we say, response to all the hype surrounding it, with Bill kind of distancing himself, saying, hey, I didn't create this monster. Don't blame me. And then also another interesting addition is the buffer and true bypass switch, with the buffer position being labeled as almost always better and true bypass being almost always worse, which is a position that for the most part I agree with. And this also has a buffer and true bypass switch. We'll talk about the impact of that in a moment. Unfortunately, the original batches of the KTR suffered from some quality control issues, which put a bit of a dent on its reputation, although I've heard that more recent batches have been corrected after Bill sourced a different manufacturer for them. Either way, I would still say it's a pretty good way to support the original creator if you're looking for a Klon pedal, considering that they are fairly reasonable in the Klon sense of the word. And interestingly enough, Bill actually sold some original Klon Centaurs that he built in February or March of this year. And yeah, the starting bids that was posted on his eBay account were blown out of the water almost immediately, and they were selling for that aforementioned $2,000 to $3,000 price range. So you're not going to be paying anything, in the realm of affordable for something that says Centaur on it in that iconic rectangular beveled enclosure. It's just not going to happen. So keep all that in mind as we progress through this video, but that is more or less the history of the Klon. So really all it's left to unravel is the tones. Is it actually worth having? Does the sounds in the box justify its crazy price tag and all the hype and the flame wars that break out on various forums? Well, let's see. To start this simply, one of the things that you could comment that will almost guarantee an embroiled battle of the words is to say this is just another glorified Tube Screamer ripoff. And it really isn't. If anything, this is an anti-Tube Screamer or a Bizarro World Tube Screamer, because yes, it shares your basic output gain, some sort of tone control, but they all behave so differently. I think this was a conscious decision to present something that, people weren't afraid of using and to make it rather simple, but, you know, you could pair this with a tube screamer and get great sounds. I don't feel the need to for what we're doing in today's video, but they're totally different class of pedals, and one does not obsolete the other in that sense. One thing they do share in common, though, is at least on the stock Centaur, is in bypass mode, even when your pedal's not on, you've got a buffer. And again, I agree with Mr. Finnegan that for almost all situations, buffer is going to be better because this is a quality buffer design. The only time I would find the buffered option to be necessarily bad is if you're using some sort of low impedance pedal after this, which for me, I don't really think you should be doing that anyway. Anything like a fuzz or a treble booster that would create that sort of effect, I would put this before anyway. But almost always, it's going to be either exactly the same sounding or more full because you don't get that, you know, tone suck that happens with long lengths of cable and lots of pedals and all that kind of stuff. So follow the general advice of buffer at the beginning, buffer at the end of your pedal board, you'll be fine. But because we're doing a simple one pedal through amp combination with probably less than 6 feet of cable in total, there is no sonic difference between buffer and true bypass in this situation. It is good to have both, and this is a really great buffer design in terms of buffers. It's right up there with Boss. I have read that on the original Klons, you can measure somewhere around a decibel of boost on the buffer, which I can't replicate on this one. I'm getting within the margin of error, the exact same output measurement, so it may not be the same on all of them, but it doesn't matter. A dB is like nothing. We're really not sensitive to that. If anything, it's just going to sound a little fuller. At the end of the day, if your Klon derivative has the option to use either true bypass or buffered bypass, just find out which one sounds better or works better with your rig and keep it there. That's pretty much my advice. The next difference, the power supply, or at least the power section. Now, the Klon has a very, very smart power section design because it uses a lot of virtual grounds, referencing some odd voltages that you normally wouldn't see, like 4.5 volts or using 13.5 volts there. Ultimately, it turns a 9-volt power supply into 18 volts, which you can do with charge pumps and all other kind of stuff. But this gives a lot more headroom for stuff like the output section and the distortion, and can actually result in different orders of harmonics and just give an overall different sound than if you'd made the same pedal with a 9-volt topography instead. So this is very much at the core of the Klon sound, and it's something that definitely doesn't carry over in a lot of these other tube screamer derivatives. Next up, let's talk about the gain control. Now, your run-of-the-mill tube screamer design, you know, it's symmetrical clipping diodes or even asymmetrical clipping diodes, to some extent is going to sound rather compressed, kind of staticky in a weird way. The overall texture of the gain doesn't change as you increase the potentiometer. It just gets more saturated. The overall frequency response doesn't change that dramatically. It does let in more low and high frequency content, so that contour mid bump we're all used to seeing, it becomes more of something like that. But in general, you're hearing the same sort of sound. If you put it through a high gain amplifier, it's not really going to sound all that different. If you put it through a low gain amplifier, it just adds a little bit more of that warm, smooth, round sound that we're all accustomed to hearing. Totally opposite with this. With gain at 0, this is essentially a glorified clean level boost, because not only is the frequency response more or less flat, maybe a little accentuation in the high end, it doesn't let any perceivable dirt through. So you could use it that way, missing a lot of the magic of the Klon, but hey, there you go. However, as you turn up the gain control, it actually starts to accentuate the mids around 1000 hertz quite significantly, which is genius because that's kind of what you want to do anyway as you let more gain in. You can get way too flubby, way too harsh if you were to keep this frequency response flat. And it's it's what a lot of amplifiers do naturally, or it's what we would do with a boost pedal if we were trying to combat some of those flubby frequencies. And then once you get past about here, you're into kind of jangly JTM 45 sounds, maybe a little bit more than that into hot rod plexi material, and then, you know, full bore boosted JCM 800 kind of tones. Bill and plenty of forum posters alike claimed that the magic of the gain structure from this pedal comes from the germanium diodes used in its hard clipping design, which is reminiscent of the likes of MXR distortions or earlier Boss designs, not to be confused with germanium transistors seen in fuzz faces or treble boosters, that sort of thing. I bet there's other kinds of diodes that get close, but according to Bill, he tested a whole bunch, and these were the ones that he settled on to create the Klon sound. So whatever it may be, just the general gain structure topology or that magic diode definitely isn't the op amp. It's a decent one, but nothing particularly special. It makes a unique sound. It's very amp-like and not necessarily the high-end bite or what, you know, some of us might think about when it comes to tube amps, but when you pair this with, say, that mid-scooped American style amplifier, you can absolutely make up for the lack of a loud power section or make it sound like a different amp entirely. Now, the overall output level from this distortion section isn't all that different from a lot of these 3 knob designs we've seen before. It's after the summing op amp and the passive output control where we see an insane amount of clean headroom. So if you look at the chart here, even setting gain to minimum and using the output control as just a clean level boost, you get way more volume than you would out of a run-of-the-mill tube screamer. And this is another thing that makes this pedal so powerful, because not only can you add a lot of dirt in terms of the gain control, you can push your amp into natural overdrive by just hitting it really hard. And it's balancing these two that makes for some really interesting tonal combinations depending on what you're going for. Finally, we have the accurately named treble control. And instead of being kind of your run-of-the-mill shifting tone stack thing you'd see in most amps or pedals, this is actually more akin to a hi-fi high shelf control that you'd see on like a home stereo. So this has like a critical frequency of around 2000 hertz, full range from about 200 hertz onwards. As you turn this up, you get a big shelf like you'd see in a parametric EQ, and the opposite when you turn it down. This is another example of where I've seen my results differ from what some people have said about the original Klon Centaurs, but it generally does the same thing, and if anything, this has a little more range on the top end. Not sure exactly how that's going to translate to all pedals out there, but you can, in general, dial them in the same. Now, when you look at the output frequency response on the overall unit, this makes it a little quieter as you turn down the treble and a little louder as you turn up the treble, although it doesn't affect the lower frequencies, and it actually shifts that mid-hump down depending on where you have it. So if you've got a really jangly, bright, brittle amp, then, you know, try rolling this off, or if you're going for a mid-boost kind of thing. And if you've got a really dark, muddy thing, or you want to accentuate some of the high end on, say, a humbucker-equipped guitar, turn it up. As most of you can probably imagine, there are literally countless tonal combinations with this pedal, especially when combined with different amps. So I'm just going to show you a few of my favorites, especially the ones that I think will translate across multiple setups. And to do that, I'll be using 2 different amplifiers. I'll be using the clean channel on the single rectifier, which if you can make this work, it's a good pedal. Be using the lead channel on the last demo and throw in the gargoyle on one as well. But this is what I would call like the always on dirt boost. This is sort of faking power amp breakup, sort of just making an otherwise sterile clean channel a little more lively. So I turn output level to about unity gain. I don't want it to be really that much louder in case you want to switch between the two of them. Yes, that's about unity gain. Gain control, I want it little past, you know, plexi breakup, but not quite. Kind of want, you know, jangly neck single coil on a Telecaster, just a little bit of bite on a, you know, say the bridge humbucker or something like that. And I do want to accentuate the higher frequencies just a little bit. So treble, little past noon, roughly 1 o'clock, and of course tuned to taste. But with the setup here, I really dig this for those classic Tele or Strat tones. Another one of my favorite clean amp platforms is this magic 8-ball setting, I guess you could call it, everything at 3 o'clock, or 8 as a Marshall style amp would label it. And this is like a cool channel 2 sound, maybe not super high gain lead thing, but it lies in this cool sweet spot where it's not like a super saturated 2 preamp tone, but it's not an entirely transistor, pedal sounding thing either. I quite like it. Now, if you have a more sensitive amplifier, then this may be like super saturated. It could sound really cool as well. But this is like, maybe country lead, rockabilly, southern rock, classic rock, whatever. It might work for you. But this is, I think, one of those settings that really stands out as like, this is a definitive Klon sound. Not much else does this. Another super simple configuration to remember, everything at noon. And this can be viable on a clean channel, but I find that once you dial in a preamp to sound good with this, it doesn't sound all that full or remarkable once you disengage the Klon. So your mileage may vary. I prefer this as kind of a crunch to high gain thing, and I'll be using the Cherry Tone Gargoyle for this. Sorry for making this look like a Cherry Tone ad. It's not. This is to represent lower gain plexis or even, J&P style amps that need a little kick in the ass. This amp doesn't need it. I'm going to tell you right now. I could use a clean boost through the high input, and not even that, and get insanely amazing tones. But this is to show that, with even, kind of gratuitous settings here, the character of this amp doesn't really change. It still sounds like, a hot rod plexi, which is kind of the definition of a transparent overdrive, right? I think that term gets overused a lot, but in this case, it's really true because I don't hear that and think, oh, well, there's a pedal boosting this amp. No, it just kind of sounds like more of this amplifier. So this cascading gain thing, love that word, it seriously just sounds like you've cranked a preamp tube. So awesome stuff. To round it all out, I have what I would call the semi-clean boost, and this would be for high gain applications. And we're using the rectifier lead channel, and I think the Klon and rectifier are like a match made in heaven, perhaps even better than a tube screamer and rectifier in many ways. But I'm kind of in what seems to be a bit of a minority here, in that a lot of people just like to, crank output and move treble to taste and keep gain at minimum, because this does have an insane amount of output headroom, even in its cleanest form. I get that, but it kind of is flat and boring and honestly flubby, and I'm not really a big fan of that. What I like to do is keep treble at about noon, output, we'll turn that down just a little bit, but turn gain up until it's just mid-boosting enough. And with gain this low, as I showed earlier, it doesn't really sound all that much like dirt. It just sounds more saturated when you're hitting an already high gain amp. So you play with that and output to taste, and you get a very unique mid-boost sound. It's more akin to the Super Overdrive, which is also in that 900 to 1000 hertz range at its stock settings. But I think this is a more modern, almost musical taste to it in a certain sense. The rhythms are still chunky as hell. You still got a lot of low end definition that you don't hear on those boring, pedals that do this in its EQ section. Very well balanced, and it just suits American style high gain amps really well. So we've made it to the end of the video, and we've dug our way out of yet another rabbit hole. What have we learned? Well, to me, I think the circuit is just phenomenal. There is some great, both applied and academic circuit design going on that has shaped the pedal market in untold ways. And I think this is something that is way more versatile than it gets credit for, at least in my age group. There's a lot of, people that I've seen, just like, again, it's a glorified 3-knob thing, and it's for dad rockers that just sit in front of their Blues Deluxe with a Ash Telecaster and play Eagles licks all day. It's more versatile than that. Is there other stuff out there that can probably do the same thing in certain ways? Sure, but I kind of get the sentiment that if there's one drive pedal to have, this would not be a bad pick whatsoever, especially the Horsebreaker, considering it has a whole other flavor of thing. If you're specifically one genre, if you're a death metal player, just get an EQ pedal. If you're going for SRV tones, then, Tube Screamer through whatever you have, probably fine. But, if you've already got a decent tube head and you're in, a couple grand here and there, then hell, what's another 100 or so for a Klon derivative that's going to sound 95%, if not 100% accurate. So go out there, see, what's available on the market. A lot of this stuff gets flipped constantly. And I think this is the first product on this series that I can say, yeah, I get it. I get why people like it and why it has such a rambunctious reputation around it. It made some waves in a good way. Obviously, don't pay $3,000 for an original one unless you just have insane fuck you money. Then do whatever you want while you're watching my channel. But it's really cool, and I might have opened up a new wormhole for me in terms of buying different kind of pedals like this. At one point, it was Tube Screamer derivatives, then I switched to EQ, clean boosts, and now I'll probably start looking at more Klon stuff. But yeah, I'm a fan. Maybe you'll see more of it on the channel. Any other questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below, and we will see you next time. Bye.